Utkin, I'd like to welcome you in Bucharest for another great event that we had today at ESGA. And I would like to start with the mention that it was a very important debate for our audience here in Bucharest, because we don't have many opportunities to discuss Eurasian Economic Union. And I would like to start and to insist on some numbers that you have provided during the events and some of your ideas regarding the results and challenges that partners are facing within the project.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be in Bucharest. I think it's a great idea to have a series of experts events when you invite different people to speak on different topics, and I'm specifically pleased to know that you had this interest in the Eurasian Economic Union. Indeed, it's one of the topics that we have discussed ever more widely with our European partners. I think you have a strong interest to this topic in leading countries of Europe, and I see that in our debate today we also had a number of Romanian experts pretty much interested in what's happening in the Union and how they could understand the Union as such. I think so far, as we speak just about the first steps of this integration group, we shouldn't concentrate just on numbers, but we should rather think about the philosophy of that. In every part of the world, in every continent, you do have integration groups that unite neighboring countries. So these countries that are neighbors and that want to develop cooperation, they reduce barriers between them. They get rid of tariffs so that this would facilitate trade within the integration group, and it would help this integration group to be more competitive worldwide. So I think you do have groups that are more successful, less successful, but in the end, basically in every part of the world, you do have this phenomenon of international integration. That means that you don't need a separate theory specifically for the Eurasian Union, like why do you need Eurasian Union? In every part of the world, you do have this rationale for reducing barriers with neighbors and making those groups of countries more competitive in the global world. I think this is at least the idea of participants of the Eurasian Economic Union, so to be more competitive, to cooperate more with each other, including not just on trade, but well, development of industries, development of common energy market. These are things that we will see sort of developing over the next few years. So the results are not yet there on number of projects that are already launched by the Eurasian Union, but I think they will be coming slowly, and we'll see what's happening with the Union. I do think that as of today, we can just see by numbers of trade of each country that makes part of the Eurasian Union that you have Russia and the EU as important trading partners for basically each of these countries. So when we think of the Eurasian Union, we should keep in mind that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. You have the European Union just next door, you have China just next door, and with those bigger neighbors, the Eurasian Union is willing to cooperate, not to close its doors on those partners, but to create communication channels that will help both the Eurasian Union to develop, to be competitive, and that would be beneficial for those neighbors, for the EU and China. The idea is to have Eurasia-wide cooperation that would be mutually beneficial.
It was a question for from the audience, but we did not have the time to discuss this comment. What are the main challenges for Eurasian Economic Union now, knowing the fact that Commonwealth of Independent States was not so efficient, or it was perceived as an inefficient regional model of integration?
I'd say that the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, it wasn't an international integration group at all. Some people called it a kind of divorce agreement, so that it would be easier for countries of the former Soviet Union to resolve issues that existed between them after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that was basically what the CIS could hope to achieve. So in most cases when we use the CIS formula today, we speak about most of the post-Soviet space that still communicates with one another on those intergovernmental fora. Basically, it's if you compare it to anything, it's more like British Commonwealth, which is a communication platform, which is a reflection of all the historic ties. But this is not international economic integration per se. You did have an economic element to the CIS. You did have, at best, free trade arrangements between the countries. But it's not the same thing as advanced economic integration. It's neither a customs union, and the Eurasian Union is a customs union. It's no attempt to construct a common economic space, and the Eurasian Economic Union is trying to create a common economic space. So the Eurasian Economic Union is basically the first relatively successful attempt to build a true international integration in this area. And I could remind you that when the Soviet Union collapsed, you did have governments of newly independent states sort of promising to the people that they will try to keep the barriers between those newly independent states low, because the idea was not to run away from each other, but to have sovereign centers of decision making that would cooperate with each other and would make life of people better. And in most cases, people and businesses benefit when they don't have to face any new barriers in their cross-border communication. So that was the original promise. It was sort of never really held by the governments. But now we have a smaller group of nations, basically the Eurasian Economic Union. So far it's just 5 countries out of 15 former republics of the Soviet Union. You have just 5 participating in the Eurasian Economic Union. But this might be a good and more realistic kind of beginning for true economic integration, because if you have everything, if you have everyone on board, you immediately get trouble with what people in the European Union call lowest common denominator. You have someone who is most skeptical, and you have to adapt to the position of this most skeptical member. In this case, you have a smaller group, and it's easier for them to come together to build a consensus on what they actually want to do. Because on most things that are discussed by the Eurasian Economic Union, you do need a consensus decision by the participating governments. You cannot outvote one of the members when everybody else is willing to have some decision adopted. You need to have everyone on board, and this on the one hand creates certain constraints, but these are constraints to keep the group together, and the group stays together so far.
This is not the first initiative to create a common economic space. It was launched, the idea, in 2003, if I remember well. But I will point that in 2011, when the project was launched, and all the three presidents in their articles published by ESGA, they have mentioned the role of the EU as a model for the future Eurasian Union at that time. Can you see some elements that can prove that Eurasian Economic Union can be transformed in the future into a normative power for the partners, or for the I mean, when I talk about partners, I don't mean only the members of the Eurasian Economic Union.
I spoke of the Eurasian Economic Union as a first relatively successful attempt to build this common economic space. You did have indeed attempts to start that, but they basically failed. And the one that you mentioned, it was meant to integrate Ukraine. And that was the original idea of that earlier project. I understand that many people thought of Ukraine as a very important potential participant of this integration group, but today we are further than we ever were for having Ukraine as part of any integration group in this area. We don't know what will happen in the longer term, but for now I think no one is even thinking of a possibility to integrate Ukraine. So this is a different project, this is a new project, sort of unrelated to this earlier attempt. As to the experience of the European Union, I think people, of course, they try to use the best experience available. So they look around, they see that the European Union is so advanced and pretty successful, and they want to use some of this European Union's experience to achieve similar results. But we have to keep in mind that this is a different group of countries. It's not just different governments, political regimes, different economies. These are also different balances of economic weight between Russia and neighbors that participate. You have Russia as more dominant. So in some respects, the European Union is probably even not the best reference point. If you look, for example, at Mercosur, where you have Brazil participating, probably this could be a better reference point. But if you try using like Mercosur experience, whom would you be able to persuade by that? Very few people really pay attention in our region to what happens in Latin America. At least they don't research that in detail. So the European Union is just a much more well-known reality. Even people who don't deal specifically with international relations, they know what the European Commission is about, how it's structured, how people sort of deal with different areas in the European Union. So you may use their knowledge to make them understand what the Eurasian Economic Union is about. In the Eurasian Economic Union, you also have this Eurasian Economic Commission, you have the head of the Commission, you have the commissioners, ministers of this commission who deal with specific portfolios. So it speaks the same language as the European Union is speaking, and I think from what I heard from both the EU and the Eurasian Union, officials, they always make this point that in many respects they understand each other better on this technical level than, let's say, politicians or diplomats who discuss those high politics issues that are much more controversial, that are not easy to resolve, that very often go in circles again and again without any solution being found. In case of the Eurasian Union, you may be much more pragmatic. You may address those issues that the EU is dealing with, the Eurasian Union is dealing with, like customs regulations, like standards and norms that are that are established by the European Union on one side, and that could be adopted by the Eurasian Union on the other if it's nothing that goes against the interests of participating states. So you do have experience exchange willingly or unwillingly. People do use experience available. But I also think we should understand that the Eurasian Economic Union is not the European Union in the making. It's nothing that can become a copy of the European Union. It's a different entity. It's one of the integration groups that exist all over the world. And what's important for the European Union is not that, well, it will soon have anything like the European Union just nearby, but that this is a neighbor. And if neighbors decided to cooperate like that, to transfer their competences for trade policies on the level of this Eurasian Economic Commission and allow this Eurasian Economic Commission to elaborate international agreements. Like if you would have a free trade agreement between the European Union and Russia, you wouldn't have it with Russia alone. You would need to have it with the Eurasian Economic Union, because this is a customs union. So this united customs area, and it's with this customs area you will have the free trade agreement. That means for the European Union that, well, this is point of contact. This Eurasian Economic Commission is a body they need to communicate with. So that's a kind of a decision of members of the Eurasian Union that they should cooperate, and as a function of this decision, you have you have this necessity for the European Union to build up a relationship with those bodies of the Eurasian Union if it wants to cooperate with member states of the Eurasian Union. So these are neighbors. They are different to a large extent. They can speak same language. They can use this same language to express their different interests to each other, and sometimes they realize that these interests in certain areas are not so different. So they may be common, and the most obvious common interest is to reduce troubles that people might be having when they get engaged into economic activity in this space that involves, on the one hand, the European Union, on the other, the Eurasian Union, and very importantly, countries of the common neighborhood, so countries that do not make part neither of the Eurasian Union nor of the European Union.
When we are talking about European Union, the meaning of the stability is different. I mean, we have economic stability, we have stability at the borders of the European Union, we have resilient public institutions. What means for Eurasian Economic Union stability? What are the main goals in this way to have and to be perceived as a stable project for the members?
Very often when we talk about the Eurasian Economic Union, people underline that the word economic is very important. So this union is about economic development, and that's a very strong and pretty stable position of participating member states, that they want to keep this union economic. That means that when you don't speak just about this bunch of countries, but you speak about this particular organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, you inevitably speak about economic stability and mainly macroeconomics. If economies of the Eurasian Union feel well, that creates good basis for development of this integration group as a whole. If economies that constitute the union face troubles, then the whole union faces troubles. And this is the scenario they, of course, want to avoid. So if they feel like there is a necessity to help one of the members in terms of macroeconomic stability, in terms of economic development, because otherwise there would be some troubles arising first on the national level inside this member state, and then they could spread to other members of the Eurasian Union. Then you understand that you have to act, you have to help. The trouble is, of course, that if Russia faces troubles, then you can hardly help that. You can hardly help macroeconomic stability in Russia, say, through the mechanisms of the Eurasian Economic Union, because, well, it's not huge enough to help such a big country, a big economy. But luckily, in terms of macroeconomic stability, Russia has been quite all right in the past decades. I think you can blame the Russian government for many things, but in terms of being very scrupulous in maintaining this macroeconomic stability, it's one of those priorities that they managed to maintain over the years, and this creates one of the pillars for the future development of the Eurasian Economic Union. I think this is also understood by many investors who understand that there are economic troubles and then there are economic troubles. Economic troubles are different. And some of them are very obvious to the citizens, but they are not so profound that they would hit the core of the economy. And I think most of the foreign investors, they see that the economic core of both Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union is still quite all right in comparison to a number of other countries in the world that actually experience those macroeconomic troubles.
In your opinion, what is more difficult now for Eurasian Economic Union? To find opportunities to cooperate with European Union, with other European countries, or to cooperate with Asian countries, or to find willingness to be more open to a political dialogue, to develop the organization in the future, to look at the future of the organization from the political point of view?
I don't think we will see sort of political pillar added to the Eurasian Economic Union anytime soon. I think it will rather develop as an economic entity. But speaking of what some experts call pivot to Asia, I think to a large extent most of the world's countries are pivoting to Asia, and the European Union members are among the leading ones. So if you look at trade balances of Asian countries, of those Asian tigers that develop pretty well, you will see that for many of them, among the leading trading partners, they have the European Union. And it's not a civilizational choice that they make or something like that. It's not a political. It's a mere reflection of the fact that the European Union is a very important economic center of the world. So it produces a lot, it consumes a lot, and that makes it one of the key trading partners for Asian countries. So that's just a reflection of the fact that you do already have more than half of humanity, of humankind, living in Asia. You have a huge market for goods. You have a lot of relatively cheap labor force that can be used for production of goods. And that makes people interested in Asia. That also happens to Russia, that also happens to other countries of the Eurasian Economic Union. They do want to develop their contacts to Asian partners, but when this notion of pivot to Asia is used, Russian officials try to repeatedly correct it, that it's not a pivot like you are pivoting to one power center and away from the other. It's more like rebalancing. It's finding the strength that Russia might have in Asia and that was formerly absent, but at the same time with the understanding that the European Union remains a key partner in trade both for Russia and for most of the states of the Eurasian Economic Union. You still, in spite of the sanctions war, have like 45% of Russia's trade turnover as trade with the European Union. So the European Union is important and will remain important in the future, both for Russia and for the Eurasian Economic Union as a whole. At the same time, I think the search for new opportunities in other world regions will continue, and this is just a reflection of globalization, a reflection of the fact that it's ever easier to build such economic ties with countries that might be geographically far away, but that might be helpful in a particular enterprise that you are trying to launch. So we'll see more and more of these global value chains of enterprises that do not just develop inside national borders of one country, but that include many countries. And I think this is also one of the ideas of this Eurasian Economic Union, to have more enterprises that are competitive enough to, well, first include different countries of the Union as such, but also to go beyond the borders of the Union, so to produce some important parts, industrial goods, that can contribute to globally competitive production lines in cooperation with multinational enterprises.
Until now, into the Eurasian Economic Union stepped in member states with the same interests. I mean, politically, economically, and not only. We have some results in the Eurasian Economic Union as a project, and it's interesting for other countries from Asia, and not only from Asia, I mean BRICS and other regional model of cooperation, to integrate and to add some initiative to cooperate. What are the guarantees that with other leaders on board, I mean with other member states on board, the Eurasian Economic Union will have the same path to develop in the future as it was established from the beginning?
Well, first, I don't think that we should expect any rapid enlargement of the Eurasian Economic Union as such, as an organization. You may probably have people speculating about possible membership for one or two post-Soviet countries. Tajikistan is most often mentioned, but at the same time you have skeptics regarding that, and I think everybody is sort of looking again at the experience of the European Union that is that is coming through a certain enlargement fatigue. It's the population, the economies, they're getting tired of the fact that they all the time need to pay attention to some weaker members that are willing to join, but then they experience troubles. So the European Union is trying to slow down the enlargement process. And for the Eurasian Union, I think it's also quite obvious that if they suddenly start to concentrate on enlargement in the expense of other more important topics, in the expense of, well, basically integrating the group, then this will create trouble for the Union in the longer run. So I think you will rather not see new members, but you will see new partnerships. We already have a free trade agreement between the Eurasian Economic Union and Vietnam, a country of 100 million people, so it's not insignificant, be it for Vietnam or for the Eurasian Economic Union. You have a trade and economic cooperation agreement with China, which is not a free trade agreement. It's more like experience exchange cooperation, anti-dumping, defense of intellectual property, property rights. But in the end, that means that China is interested in developing those ties with the Eurasian Economic Union. And for China, this is not just a trading partner, but this is also an infrastructural connection to Europe. So most of the land infrastructure that might lead from China to the European Union would go via the territory of member states of the Eurasian Economic Union. Not just Russia. In most cases, it's the infrastructure that starts at the border with Kazakhstan, goes to the Russian territory, and then goes to Belarus. So in a case that you have in the Eurasian Economic Union infrastructural cooperation of those members, it might make easier for the European Union and for China to build those infrastructural connectors to ensure that popular buzzword today, connectivity is there, that you don't experience much trouble when traveling with your goods from China to Europe and back. That's one of the important tasks that will be addressed and that make international partners interested. You also already have an agreement that should lead to free trade one day with Iran, between the Eurasian Economic Union and Iran. Again, it's not just Iran as a trading partner, it's also an infrastructural connection from south to north. If you have it like working smoothly, that would mean that goods would be easily delivered basically from the Persian Gulf, from the oil-rich territory that is very frequently visited by transport lines that go through the oceans, and the landmass of Eurasia. So you may create different dimension of those infrastructural communications with Iran. You have interest, which is now a matter of negotiations, for cooperation between the Eurasian Economic Union and Singapore. You do have these kind of negotiations with Egypt, with a number of other countries, including India, including some others. I think we will see more and more of those international agreements that don't make countries members of the Eurasian Economic Union, but they will make them partners of the Eurasian Economic Union.
I think it's important to explain for the Romanian audience what is the purpose to launch the project of Greater Eurasia now, because it was launched recently by Mr. Lavrov, and it's important to see what is the difference between Eurasian Economic Union and the project of the Greater Eurasia.
I think Greater Eurasia is more like philosophy that we shouldn't see this Eurasian Economic Union as something completely isolated from the rest of the continent. You do have China on the one hand, you do have the European Union on the other, and you need to develop economic interaction with those two. So Russian diplomats, they basically see this Greater Eurasia as an offer to other Eurasia-based countries to cooperate, not to see this Eurasian Economic Union as something closed for them, but on the contrary, to see it as a partner in negotiations and economic cooperation. I think the danger of this idea is that when you start playing with those great notions like Greater Eurasia, Greater Europe,
it's a risk for Russian Federation now.
I think it's a risk also from the intellectual point of view. But when you use the term, you should all the time try to respond to a simple question: what that would mean in practice, because you may like stop at just using this slogan. It sounds good, and you will not be forced to do anything particular. When you get down to the details of what's wrong, for example, between Russia and China in terms of economic cooperation, what's wrong between Russia and the European Union, then you address those specific issues that step by step would move you in the direction of this seamless space of economic cooperation that would help every country in Eurasia. But if you start from the top, if you start from the idea of Greater Eurasia, and you would think of some kind of a treaty that would unite every country of the continent, I think you will not achieve the results. You have to start from small things, and then you will gradually move in the right direction.
Mr. Sergey Utkin, I would like to thank you for the debate today. It was a very pleasant discussion, and for the interview, and I hope that we will have you as a guest speaker for other events at ESGA or in Bucharest for other conferences. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.